The sun was nearing its peak, casting long, golden rays over the village nestled on the Kenyan coastline. As waves kissed the shore in a slow, rhythmic dance, the air held a weighty silence, punctuated only by the occasional call of distant seabirds and the rustling of palm fronds swaying lazily in the breeze. The village was bustling, as it did every day, but there was a softness in the midday lull that settled over everything, wrapping it in a kind of dusty warmth. Under this blanket of sun and salt, Naima wandered through the narrow paths that crisscrossed the village, her sandals kicking up little plumes of dust with every step. She felt out of place yet oddly at home in her loose, airy dress, its bright, flowing fabric contrasting with the earthy tones of the surrounding huts and the weathered faces of the villagers. This was her parents' birthplace, a place of stories and memories she had only heard of in whispered recollections told in a distant country, half a world away. The village had been painted as something nearly mythical in those stories, and now, seeing it with her own eyes, she found it to be even more alive, more real than she dared to imagine. It was then, as she strolled, soaking in the sights and sounds, that she first saw Mzee Juma. He was sitting alone on a flat rock by the shore, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something only he could see. His figure was stooped yet firm, wrapped in a simple, worn kanga that had long since faded to muted colors. Deep lines cut across his face, etched by decades of sun, salt and wind, and his skin had a weathered, almost bronzed quality that seemed to carry the essence of the earth itself. His beard, stark white and neatly trimmed, framed his face, adding an aura of wisdom to his already solemn expression. Naima paused, transfixed by the scene before her. Mzee Juma looked like something ancient and immovable, as if he were a part of the landscape itself, rooted in place by time and experience. The villagers had spoken of him in tones reserved for legends and spirits, recounting his feats as a fisherman, his deep connection to the ocean, and the countless stories he guarded like treasures. Yet seeing him here, alone by the sea, he seemed more human than myth, a man caught in the grip of memories too deep to share. A gentle breeze stirred, and Naima took a hesitant step forward, as if afraid to disturb the sanctity of the moment. Her shadow stretched out over the sand, reaching toward him like a tentative bridge. As she approached, she felt the weight of the world shift slightly, as if the air between them held a secret, a whispered promise only half understood. Mzee Juma didn't turn as she came closer. His gaze remained fixed on the water, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of her presence. He was used to the rhythms of the village, to the familiar faces of friends and neighbors, and the strangers that came and went with the changing tides. But this young woman Naima, though he did not yet know her name, brought with her a different energy, one that felt both foreign and familiar. As she drew near, Naima noticed a small woven bag at Mzee Juma's side, half filled with shells and smooth stones. She felt a spark of curiosity. The objects looked ordinary enough, but the way they lay carefully arranged in the bag suggested they held a greater significance for him, perhaps symbols of memories or even a kind of talisman. She wondered how many times he had walked these shores, how many stories he carried within him, stories hidden in each shell and pebble. Her heart pounded, a mix of nervousness and awe. She couldn't explain why, but being close to him made her feel like a child again, like she was standing before some grand, ancient force she couldn't quite comprehend. She knelt down a short distance from him, folding her legs beneath her in the warm sand, and looked out at the ocean, mimicking his quiet contemplation. They sat like this, side by side yet separated by generations, in a silence that was as natural as breathing. The sun glinted off the water, casting sparkles over the surface, and Naima let her thoughts drift, caught up in the rhythm of the waves. There was a peace to it, a timelessness that made her feel connected to something larger than herself. Mzee Juma had always known this feeling. It was the reason he came to this spot every day, why he walked these shores and gathered his shells and stones. In the presence of the sea, he could feel the pulse of the world, the ebb and flow of life itself. Without speaking, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small, polished stone, its surface smooth and worn by years of waves and sand. He held it out to her, an offering without words, and she accepted it with both hands, cradling it gently. The stone was warm, almost alive in her grasp, and she felt a sudden rush of emotion, a mixture of gratitude, humility, and a kind of reverence. She didn't need to ask why he had given it to her. She understood, in some unspoken way, that it was a gift, a piece of his world shared with her, a connection between them formed in the silent language of nature. In that moment, Naima knew that this man, Mzee Juma, held more than stories. He held a kind of wisdom, a way of seeing the world that went beyond words or gestures. His presence alone spoke of a life deeply rooted in the earth and sea, of memories woven into the fabric of the village itself. She looked down at the stone in her hand and knew that she had found something precious, something she had come here searching for without even knowing it. They sat together like this for what felt like hours, the sun climbing higher and casting their shadows across the sand. Neither of them spoke, but in that quiet companionship, an understanding grew between them, a bond that didn't need words to be felt. And as the waves continued their endless dance, Naima realized that she had just met someone who would change her life forever. Days passed in a slow, steady rhythm, much like the waves that lapped at the village shores, each day bringing Naima closer to Mzee Juma, and each encounter deepening the invisible thread between them. She had started visiting him every morning, sometimes carrying simple offerings from the villagers, freshly baked flatbread wrapped in banana leaves, sweet coconut juice in a small clay jug, or fruits from the market. These were offerings from a community that loved him, a quiet way of saying they valued his place among them. Mzee Juma would accept them with a small nod, a gesture so subtle it was barely a response, and then the two would sit together in companionable silence. For Naima, the days spent with Mzee Juma became her favorite part of life in the village. He was always there, waiting on his rock, gazing at the sea as if it held answers only he could comprehend. She would take her place beside him, a respectful distance apart, and they would share the hours in stillness, both immersed in their own thoughts yet tethered by a shared presence. There was no need for conversation. It was as if words would disturb the quiet understanding that flowed between them. In the early mornings, Naima began helping the villagers as they prepared to head out on their daily routines. She would lend a hand with whatever needed doing, hauling buckets of water from the well, mending fishing nets, or gathering firewood from the outskirts of the village. She felt herself falling into the rhythm of village life, a life that was simpler yet fuller than she had ever known. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, she would make her way to the beach, always finding Mzee Juma there, always ready to share his silent company. Every so often he would reach into his bag and pull out another small token, a stone, a shell, or a piece of driftwood worn smooth by the tides, and hand it to her. She had come to understand that these objects were more than souvenirs. They were fragments of his memories, relics of a life spent by the ocean, and each one felt like a gift, a piece of his wisdom passed into her care. She kept these treasures carefully, arranging them on a small wooden shelf in her hut. The collection grew, each item a silent testament to their deepening bond. One afternoon, a storm gathered on the horizon, casting a dark, churning sky over the village. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of rain and salt, and the villagers hurriedly pulled in their boats, securing them with ropes and weights. Naima watched as the sea became wild, its waves crashing violently against the shore, the normally gentle rhythm transformed into something fierce and untamed. She felt a sense of awe, as if witnessing the raw power of nature for the first time. Despite the storm, Mzee Juma remained on the beach, unmoved by the chaos around him. He stood by his rock, watching the turbulent sea with a calm intensity that spoke of a lifetime spent in its embrace. Naima approached him slowly, drawn by his presence, and stood by his side as the rain began to fall in heavy, soaking sheets. Together they faced the storm, unflinching, their clothes clinging to them as the rain poured down, each gust of wind pushing them back slightly. And yet neither of them moved. The storm raged around them, but in that moment they were as steadfast as the rock beneath their feet. When the storm passed, leaving behind a soft, misty calm. Mzee Juma turned to the ocean one last time, then glanced down at Naima, his gaze softer than she'd ever seen it. Without a word, he took a step back, leaving her there, a silent signal for her to look at the ocean alone. She stood there, her heart pounding, feeling as if she had just been entrusted with a secret, a hidden truth whispered to her by the waves themselves. She understood in some quiet way that the sea held a different meaning for him, one she was only beginning to comprehend. As days melted into weeks, the villagers noticed the unusual companionship between them. They watched as Naima and Mzee Juma sat side by side, always in silence, their connection a mystery that no one dared to question. Some saw in Naima a daughter he had never had, while others whispered of a friendship that went beyond age, rooted in something that defied explanation. And yet the villagers respected it, sensing the bond between them was a private thing, a connection woven in the spaces where words were not needed. In time, Naima began to see glimpses of Mzee Juma's past, not through his words, but through the stories the villagers shared in hushed tones around the fires at night. They spoke of his younger days, of his strength as a fisherman, of a love that had once burned brightly but had ended tragically when his wife passed many years ago. The village elders would sometimes lower their voices, casting glances in his direction as they spoke of the sea's hold over him, of how he was never the same after her death. There was an unspoken belief that he was bound to the ocean, that it had become his true companion in her absence, a love that was as endless and unknowable as the tides. Naima found herself watching him with a new kind of reverence, understanding now why he spent his days by the water, why he watched the waves with such a piercing gaze. She saw in him a man who had lived a life marked by love and loss, a life shaped by the endless pull of the ocean. And in the silence they shared, she began to feel that same pull, a connection to the land and the sea that had once felt foreign but was now becoming her own. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a soft, golden light over the beach, Mzee Juma finally broke their silence. It wasn't a story or a question, but a simple observation, one that felt as natural as the breeze itself. He spoke of the tides, of how they came and went, bringing life and taking it away, leaving the beach littered with new treasures for those who knew where to look. His words were sparse, carefully chosen, each one carrying a weight that went beyond their literal meaning. Naima listened, absorbing every word, and as he finished, she felt a shift within herself, a realization that she too was part of this cycle, this ebb and flow of life. She knew then that she had come to the village searching for something she hadn't been able to name, and that in Mzee Juma's quiet companionship she had found it. As darkness fell, she turned to leave, glancing back one last time at the silhouette of Mzee Juma against the darkening sky. He remained there, as always, a silent figure by the sea, a man rooted in the land, and yet forever drawn to the ocean. And as Naima walked away, she felt a peace settle over her, a quiet understanding that somehow their friendship was like the sea itself, boundless, timeless, and ever-changing. They continued in this way, bound by shared silences and the simple gifts of shells and stones, their friendship a thing both profound and unspoken. And in each quiet moment they spent together, Naima felt herself growing, her heart expanding to hold not just her own memories, but the weight of a life she had come to cherish, a life forever intertwined with the rhythm of the waves and the wisdom of an old man who had learned the language of the sea. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, painting the clouds with streaks of deep crimson and purple as Naima made her way toward the beach where she knew Mzee Juma would be waiting. Over the past few months, her visits had become ritualistic, woven into the fabric of her days. Today, though, there was an unusual feeling in the air, a kind of heaviness that made each step feel significant, as if she were being drawn towards some moment she couldn't yet see. When she reached the familiar spot by the baobab tree, there was Mzee Juma, standing tall, though slightly hunched, his gaze lost in the horizon as always. But there was something different in his posture, a tension, a sense of quiet gravity that she hadn't noticed before. He seemed rooted to the spot, as though he were bound not just to the earth beneath his feet, but to something far deeper, something unseen. Naima approached slowly, not wanting to break the silence that seemed to hold everything in place. She stopped a few steps behind him, waiting, sensing that whatever was stirring in him was close to the surface. The ocean lay before them, vast and calm, its gentle waves glinting under the fading light. The scene was both serene and solemn, like the beginning of some sacred ritual. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mzee Juma reached into the pocket of his worn kanga and pulled out a small, weathered object. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers moving with a practiced gentleness, as if he were holding something immensely fragile. Naima's eyes followed his hands, curious but not wanting to intrude on whatever private moment he was having. She knew better by now than to ask questions, trusting that if he wanted her to know, he would find a way to share it. With a slow, deliberate movement, he extended his hand toward her, offering her the object. She reached out, cradling it in her palms, feeling its weight and texture. It was a tiny carved figure, smoothed by age and wear, its features worn away by years of handling and exposure to the elements. She studied it, sensing that it held a story, a piece of him he was entrusting to her. He took a deep breath, and though his voice was barely more than a murmur, it carried a weight that filled the space around them. "A promise," he said, his words floating between them, almost lost in the evening air. Naima felt a chill, a sense of solemnity settling over her, though she didn't fully understand. Slowly he began to speak, his voice carrying a tone she hadn't heard before, a mixture of sadness and resolve. He told her of the baobab tree, a tree that had stood on this shore for centuries, its roots delving deep into the earth, its branches stretching toward the sky like the arms of a spirit reaching for something far beyond its grasp. He told her of how he had sat beneath it as a boy, watching his father return from the sea, of how he had met his late wife under its shade, and of how he had come to believe that her spirit had returned to the tree after her passing, binding him to it in a way he could never truly explain. Naima listened, the tiny figure in her hands becoming heavier, almost alive with the weight of the words he spoke. She felt herself drawn into his story, as if the lines between past and present, between him and her, were beginning to blur. He turned to her then, his gaze piercing yet gentle, holding a depth of emotion that she couldn't fully understand but felt all the same. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a kind of pleading that went beyond words. He told her, with a voice filled with an almost reverent sadness, that he felt his time was drawing near. He had lived his life by the sea, his heart and soul entwined with it, and now, as the years took their toll, he knew that he would soon be called back to it. But not to the waves, he said, his voice barely a whisper, to the earth. To the earth, to the roots of the baobab. He asked her, without directly saying the words, to be the one to honor his final wish. When the time came, he wanted to be laid to rest beneath the great baobab, beside the spirit of his wife, where his soul could find peace, returning to the earth and the tree he had loved for so long. There was an urgency in his gaze, a need for reassurance that went beyond anything he had ever asked of her. Naima felt a shiver run through her, a mixture of sorrow and awe. This was no ordinary request, no mere favor. He was entrusting her with the last part of his story, with a promise that would bind her to him in a way that was as eternal as the tree itself. She understood in that moment that he was offering her a part of himself, a legacy to carry forward, and she felt both honored and humbled by the weight of it. Without speaking, she reached out, placing a hand over his, offering him the only assurance she could give. She didn't need to say the words he knew, just as she knew that she would keep his promise. The silence between them deepened, filled with an understanding that transcended language, an unbreakable bond that would remain even after he was gone. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the beach, bathing the baobab in a golden glow that made it look almost alive, its branches stretching toward the heavens, its roots digging deep into the earth. The tree stood as a silent witness to the promise they had just forged, a testament to a friendship that had grown beyond words, beyond time, rooted in a love for the land and the sea, and in a reverence for the life they had shared. Naima felt the weight of the promise settle within her, a quiet certainty that this was her purpose, her role in this place she had come to love. And as they stood together, watching the last light fade from the sky, she knew that this promise, strange and solemn, would bind her to him, to the baobab, and to the village forever. Mzee Juma returned his gaze to the sea, his face softening, his shoulders relaxing, as if a burden had been lifted. And Naima, standing beside him, felt the beginning of her own transformation, a merging of her own life with the life of this man, of this tree, and of the ancient rhythms of the land and the sea. The evening settled around them, quiet and still, the waves a gentle lullaby in the background. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, they both felt a peace descend, a calm acceptance of what lay ahead, the promise between them as sure and unyielding as the roots of the great baobab tree. A pale dawn cast its soft light over the village, illuminating each hut and pathway with a gentle touch, and the world seemed to stir slowly awake under a sky that had just begun to shift from dark to light. Naima's routine had become familiar. Each day began with small tasks, moments spent with the villagers as they prepared for the day, and always her morning walk to the beach to sit beside Mzee Juma. Their friendship had grown over time, like roots stretching deeper into rich, undisturbed soil, drawing sustenance from each shared silence, each unspoken word. But today there was an odd, lingering heaviness in the air that Naima couldn't shake off. The sea appeared unusually still, its surface mirroring the clouds above in perfect, silent symmetry, and the village itself seemed caught in a kind of waiting. She couldn't explain it, but something was coming. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. When she reached the beach, she found Mzee Juma already waiting, his figure framed by the great baobab tree, which stood as silent witness to all their meetings. He turned to her as she approached, and for the first time she noticed a kind of hesitation in his posture, a tension that was unlike him. His usual calm seemed somehow disrupted, as though something important weighed on his heart. Naima felt her own heart quicken, sensing the gravity of whatever had brought this change. She sat beside him, folding her legs beneath her and looking out at the sea, her gaze following the lazy, rolling waves that slid up the shore and retreated in an endless dance. They sat like this for some time, side by side, neither of them speaking, as if waiting for something to fall into place. And then, without preamble or hesitation, Mzee Juma shifted his weight, facing her fully, his gaze piercing yet softened by an emotion she couldn't quite name. In his hand, he held a simple piece of cloth, a kanga, delicately patterned, its edges embroidered in intricate designs. She recognized it immediately. It was something his late wife had made, a cloth he had treasured and kept carefully folded away. Now, though, he held it out to her, as if it carried a message, as if it held within it the weight of his years, of his memories, of something he could not express in words. Naima took the kanga from him, her fingers brushing against the soft, worn fabric, feeling the careful stitchwork, the years pressed into its fibers. She looked up at him, her eyes questioning, searching his face for answers. He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of memories, moments she could only imagine. There was a vulnerability in his expression, a raw openness that was almost painful to witness, as if he were exposing a part of himself that had remained hidden for too long. Slowly, as if every word required careful deliberation, Mzee Juma spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath the surface, a hint of something deeper. He told her that he had lived a long life, a life that had been rich with love and loss, a life tied to the village, the sea, and above all, to the memory of his late wife. But as he had grown older, he had come to realize that he had no one to carry on his legacy, no one to hold the memories and stories he had cherished. His words lingered in the air, each one settling like a pebble on the shore, and Naima felt a swell of emotion, a mixture of sadness and something more profound. She listened in silence, her heart open, feeling each word as if it were being etched into her soul. He spoke of his desire to leave behind a legacy, not wealth or land, but a way of life, a sense of connection to the village, to the land, to the stories that had shaped him. And in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he asked her to marry him. The proposal hung between them, as delicate as a spider's web, shimmering in the light, fragile yet impossibly strong. For a moment, Naima felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted, as if the world had tilted and left her standing on the edge of something unknown, something vast and uncharted. She looked at him, her mind racing, her heart caught between disbelief and understanding. She knew instinctively that this was no ordinary proposal. This was not about romance or passion, it was about something deeper, something rooted in the very earth beneath them. Mzee Juma was asking her to become a part of his life, his legacy, to carry forward the traditions, the memories, and the values that he held dear. He was offering her a place in his story, a place that would bind her to the village, to the land, and to him in a way that went beyond marriage, beyond any conventional bond. Naima's fingers tightened around the kanga, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions, and yet there was a clarity within her, a sense of purpose that had quietly taken shape over the months she had spent with him. She had come to the village seeking something she couldn't name, something elusive yet vital, and now, in this moment, she realized that she had found it. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the sea, Naima nodded, a quiet, resolute gesture that carried with it all the words she could not say. She accepted his proposal not as a declaration of love, but as a commitment to the life he had lived, to the values he had upheld, to the legacy he wished to leave behind. In her silence she made a promise, a vow that would bind her to him, to the village, and to the stories he had held dear. Mzee Juma's face softened, his eyes reflecting a quiet gratitude, a peace that she had never seen before. He took her hand, their fingers entwining in a gesture as old as time, a gesture that spoke of trust, of understanding, of a bond that went beyond words. They sat like that, hand in hand, as the sun rose higher, bathing them in light, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they were about to embark on together. Around them, the world began to wake. The villagers emerged from their huts, their voices carrying across the beach, mingling with the sound of the waves. Some glanced in their direction, their faces registering a mixture of surprise and understanding. They too seemed to sense that something important had transpired, something that would bind Naima and Mzee Juma to the village in a way that was both ancient and new. As the morning unfolded, Naima felt a calm settle over her, a quiet assurance that this was her path, her purpose. She had found her place not just in the village, but in the life of a man who had given her a legacy, a gift that went beyond anything she could have imagined. And as she looked at Mzee Juma, his hand still in hers, she knew that this was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter, one that would carry forward his story, his memory, his life. They rose together, their steps in sync, their shadows merging as they walked back to the village. And as they moved away from the beach, leaving the baobab and the sea behind, Naima felt a sense of belonging, a feeling of home that she had never known before. She was bound to him now, to his life, his story, his promise. And in that bond she found a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a strength that would carry her forward, guiding her through the days and years to come. The day began with a peculiar stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The village lay bathed in a soft, muted light, and even the sea, typically restless in its endless dance with the shore, seemed to be in a rare state of calm. It was the kind of morning that bore an air of expectation, as if the earth was bracing itself for a quiet revelation, a secret waiting to be unveiled. Naima felt it too. She had risen early, drawn from her dreams by a sense of urgency she couldn't quite name. Something within her was stirring, urging her to the beach where she knew she would find Mzee Juma. It had been weeks since they'd stood together beneath the ancient baobab tree, binding their lives with the strange, silent proposal that had woven her into his story and the life of the village. Now, with each step, she felt that thread pulling her toward him, drawing her into a moment that felt as inevitable as the tide. When she arrived, Mzee Juma was there, as she had known he would be. His back was to her, his gaze fixed on the sea, and his figure silhouetted against the dawn, seemed almost ethereal, as though he were already halfway to becoming part of the land and sky he so loved. Naima approached him slowly, her footsteps light and measured, as if crossing into sacred ground. She could feel the energy of the moment thrumming in the air, a quiet, solemn rhythm that beat in time with her heart. And then she saw it, the baobab tree, standing tall and majestic behind him, its gnarled branches stretched wide as if embracing the heavens. It looked different today, alive in a way she had never seen, its bark catching the light in such a way that it seemed to glow from within. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat, for there, scattered across the highest branches, were Blossom's delicate white flowers, their petals soft and pure, opening to greet the morning sun. The baobab was in bloom. The sight was breathtaking, almost otherworldly. She had heard tales from the villagers, stories passed down from one generation to the next, of how the baobab tree bloomed only once every 50 years, a rare and fleeting miracle. It was said that the tree chose its own moment to bloom, a sacred event that heralded a transition, a shift in the natural order. And now, standing beneath its canopy of blossoms, Naima felt the weight of that legend settle upon her like a cloak, wrapping her in a reverent silence. She looked at Mzee Juma, and in his expression she saw a deep, quiet acceptance, a readiness that both comforted and unsettled her. His gaze met hers, and though neither of them spoke, there was an understanding between them, a shared knowledge of what this day would bring. The baobab's bloom was a sign, a silent herald that his time had come. Without a word, he motioned for her to join him beneath the tree. She moved forward, her steps slow and deliberate, each one carrying her deeper into the moment. Together they stood in the tree's shadow, enveloped by the scent of the blossoms, a subtle, earthy fragrance that seemed to speak of both life and death, of endings and beginnings. It was a scent that grounded her, reminding her of the cycles of the earth, the endless ebb and flow of existence. They stood side by side for a long time, their gazes fixed on the horizon, watching as the sun climbed higher, casting its golden light over the sea. The waves moved in a steady rhythm, their gentle lapping against the shore a soft, endless lullaby, a song as ancient as the land itself. Naima felt the world narrowing around her, the edges blurring until there was nothing but this moment, this man, and the great blooming tree that stood as witness. As the day wore on, villagers began to gather, drawn by the sight of the baobab's blossoms, by the silent call that seemed to resonate through the village. They approached quietly, respectful of the scene before them, their faces a mixture of awe and sorrow, of reverence for the man who had been a part of their lives for as long as any of them could remember. The children looked on in wide-eyed wonder, clinging to their mothers' skirts, while the elders nodded solemnly, understanding the significance of what they were witnessing. Naima stood with Mzee Juma, her hand resting gently on his arm, and as the villagers gathered around them, she felt a deep, abiding sense of peace settle over her. She knew that this was how he wanted it, surrounded by the people he had loved, the people who had been his family. There were no words, no speeches or farewells, just the silent communion of a community honoring one of its own. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the beach, Mzee Juma turned to Naima one last time. There was a tenderness in his gaze, a softness that spoke of gratitude, of love, of a life lived with quiet dignity. He reached out, placing a hand over hers, a final silent gesture of thanks, a wordless farewell that held within it the weight of a lifetime. And then, as the first stars began to appear in the sky, he sank to the ground beneath the baobab, leaning against its massive trunk, his eyes closing as he settled into the earth. Naima knelt beside him, her hand still clasped in his, and as his breathing slowed, she felt a profound stillness settle over her, a sense of timelessness that seemed to envelop them both. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of the blossoms and the soft murmur of the sea, Mzee Juma slipped away, his spirit returning to the earth, to the roots of the baobab, to the land that had given him life. It was a gentle passing, a quiet release, as natural as the falling of a leaf or the setting of the sun. Naima felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow, it was a tear of gratitude, of love, of a deep and abiding peace. The villagers remained, their heads bowed, their voices silent, honoring the life of the man who had been their guide, their friend, their elder. They watched as Naima rose, her movements slow and graceful, her face calm and serene. She looked at each of them in turn, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared, a promise that she would carry forward the legacy he had left behind. And then, as the stars filled the sky, casting a gentle light over the beach, they began to disperse, leaving Naima alone beneath the baobab. She knelt by the freshly turned earth, her fingers tracing the soft lines of the grave, a final, silent goodbye. She knew that he was not truly gone, that his spirit lived on in the roots of the tree, in the waves that lapped at the shore, in the stories he had left behind. As she rose to her feet, the night air cool against her skin, she felt a new strength within her, a quiet resilience that came from knowing she was part of something greater than herself. She looked up at the baobab, its branches stretching toward the heavens, its blossoms glowing softly in the starlight, and she knew that his spirit was with her, a part of the land, a part of the village, a part of her. She turned, walking slowly back toward the village, each step carrying her forward, each step a testament to the promise she had made, the legacy she would uphold. And as she disappeared into the night, the baobab stood watch, a silent guardian, its blossoms a symbol of life, of death, of the eternal cycle that binds us all. Weeks passed after Mzee Juma's quiet departure, and the village settled back into its familiar rhythms, but something had shifted. The air felt different, touched by a kind of reverence, a quiet that seemed to linger over everything. Naima carried this stillness within her. She felt it when she walked through the village paths, when she watched the fishermen heading out at dawn, when she sat beneath the great baobab tree and felt the presence of the man who had become part of her life, part of her very soul. She no longer visited the beach as an outsider, she felt, instead, that she belonged to it now, tied to its stories and rhythms as deeply as Mzee Juma had been. But there was something more, a small, silent change stirring within her. She felt it in the mornings, in the odd sensations that came and went, a kind of quiet insistence that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. She had been feeling a heaviness, a weight she couldn't explain, and at first she thought it was simply the sadness, the grief that settled over her heart whenever she thought of Mzee Juma. But as the days passed, as the signs became clearer, she began to understand it wasn't grief that filled her heart, but life. She was carrying a child. The realization settled over her in a wave, bringing both awe and a quiet fear. The memory of a brief romance, a fleeting connection she had felt in the weeks before Mzee Juma's passing, returned to her. She had never expected anything to come of it, yet here it was, a new life, a new beginning. The significance of it struck her deeply. This child would be a bridge, a link between her past and her future, a continuation of the story she had begun with Mzee Juma. She sat alone under the baobab, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the presence of both the child and the spirit of Mzee Juma entwined within her, a legacy growing in ways she could never have anticipated. Naima kept her news to herself, allowing it to grow in the quiet spaces of her days, her heart swelling with a strange mixture of excitement and reverence. She didn't speak of it to anyone, but the villagers began to notice a change in her, a softness in her movements, a new light in her eyes. They whispered among themselves, sensing that something significant was taking shape, though they could not yet name it. It was as if the spirit of Mzee Juma had passed into her, as if she had become a living embodiment of the stories and memories he had cherished. The baobab tree, too, seemed to reflect this quiet transformation. Its branches, once bare of blossoms, now held a few remaining flowers, as if clinging to the last traces of that miraculous bloom. Naima spent her evenings beneath it, feeling the energy of the tree, of the earth, of the child within her, all merging into a single heartbeat, a rhythm that pulsed in time with the village itself. The villagers began to look to her with a new kind of respect, sensing in her a strength they had once seen in Mzee Juma, an understanding of things that went beyond words. One evening, as the sky blazed with the colors of sunset, Naima found herself standing at the edge of the village, looking out over the sea. The waves rolled in with a quiet insistence, each one carrying whispers of old stories, of lives that had come and gone, of a rhythm as ancient as time itself. She felt Mzee Juma's presence beside her, not as a memory, but as something living, a part of her that would never fade. She understood now that he had given her something beyond friendship or mentorship. He had given her a place within the village, a purpose that was unfolding in ways she had never imagined. The villagers approached her that evening, one by one, forming a circle around her in a silent gesture of respect and recognition. The village elder, a woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk's and a voice as soft as the wind, stepped forward, her gaze piercing yet kind. Without a word, she placed a hand on Naima's shoulder, a simple act that carried within it the weight of tradition, of generations that had come before. Naima met her gaze, feeling a surge of emotion, a quiet pride mingled with humility. She understood, in that moment, that she had been chosen not by the elder, not by the villagers, but by the very land itself. The elder spoke only a few words, her voice a soft murmur that carried over the gathering. She named Naima as the village's new guardian, the one who would care for the stories, the land, the baobab tree, and the memories of those who had come before. Naima felt a warmth spread through her, a deep, abiding sense of purpose that settled within her heart like a seed. She looked around at the faces of the villagers, at the children who gazed up at her with wide eyes, at the elders who nodded in quiet approval, at the mothers and fathers who stood with hands resting on their children's shoulders. They were her family now, her responsibility, her reason for being. Over the next few weeks, Naima found herself taking on the roles that Mzee Juma had once held. She walked the village paths with a quiet strength, listening to the stories of the villagers, gathering their worries, their joys, their memories. She tended to the baobab tree, watering its roots, whispering to it in the soft, reverent tones she had once heard Mzee Juma use. She felt a deep connection to the land, to the sea, to the people who had become her own. Each day, as her belly grew, she felt a new life within her, a life that would carry forward the legacy she had inherited, a life that would be born into a world woven with the stories and wisdom of those who had come before. And with each day the villagers grew closer to her, seeking her guidance, her quiet presence, her understanding. The children gathered around her beneath the baobab, listening as she told them the tales that Mzee Juma had shared with her, stories of the sea, of the land, of the spirits that watched over them. She spoke with a calm certainty, her voice carrying the weight of the knowledge she had absorbed, the wisdom that had been passed down to her in silence and understanding. As the seasons turned, the village settled into a new rhythm, one that included Naima at its heart. She became a part of its pulse, its song, its stories. The baobab tree flourished under her care, its branches stretching wide, its roots sinking deeper into the earth, a symbol of life, of death, of the eternal cycle that bound them all. And when her child was born, a quiet, gentle child with eyes as deep and thoughtful as Mzee Juma's, the villagers gathered to welcome the new life, to celebrate the continuation of their story, their lineage, their legacy. Naima held her child beneath the baobab, feeling the presence of the tree, of Mzee Juma, of the village around her. She felt a deep peace settle over her, a sense of completion, of fulfillment. She understood now that she had been chosen not to replace Mzee Juma, but to continue the work he had begun, to carry forward the stories, the memories, the love he had shared with the land and the sea. In the quiet moments of the night, as her child slept in her arms, Naima would sit by the baobab, feeling the weight of the earth beneath her, the cool night air against her skin, the soft murmur of the waves in the distance. She knew that she was not alone, that Mzee Juma was with her, watching over her, guiding her, his spirit forever intertwined with hers. She was the new guardian now, the keeper of the stories, the protector of the village's soul. And as the years passed, as her child grew beneath the branches of the baobab, Naima carried forward the legacy of Mzee Juma, the man who had given her a place, a purpose, a home. She became a part of the village in a way that went beyond blood or kinship. She was woven into its very fabric, a living memory, a testament to the life that had been, and the life that was yet to come. Under the shade of the ancient baobab, she watched her child play, knowing that one day the stories she had been given would pass into their hands, continuing the cycle, the legacy, the quiet, unbreakable bond that bound them all to the land, the sea, and the endless flow of life. The first light of dawn crept over the village, spilling like liquid gold across the thatched rooftops and worn pathways, illuminating each hut in a gentle glow. Naima lay awake, wrapped in the soft silence that blanketed the village before the bustle of the day began. She could feel the air thick with purpose, a quiet urging that had stirred her from sleep long before the sun's arrival. Today felt different, weighted with a solemnity she couldn't name, a silent call that echoed in her heart, compelling her towards something beyond herself. She rose slowly, slipping into the dress she had woven herself from the soft, colourful cloth the village women had helped her dye. The fabric, in shades of earthy brown and the soft blush of hibiscus, felt alive against her skin, as though it too had absorbed the spirit of the land and held within it the stories of the people who called this village home. As she adjusted the dress over her shoulders, she felt her breath steady, as if each breath carried a piece of the village, binding her closer to its heart. Outside, the sky blushed pink and lavender, a quiet herald of the day to come. Naima walked through the paths of the village barefoot, feeling the cool earth beneath her toes, grounding her with each step. She nodded to the early risers, who paused in their morning routines to acknowledge her with gentle smiles, understanding glances. Their faces were a mixture of familiarity and something new, a quiet respect that had grown in recent weeks, since the village had gathered to honor Mzee Juma. Even now, the villagers' respect for Naima seemed to grow silently, like seeds sprouting beneath the soil, nurtured by unspoken trust. As she approached the great baobab tree, her gaze lifted to the thick branches that stretched wide above, ancient limbs that had weathered countless seasons. The tree was older than anyone in the village could remember, a silent witness to generations of lives and stories. Today its blossoms, rare, pure white flowers, dotted the branches, their delicate petals glowing faintly in the soft light. The tree's blooming was something the villagers spoke of in hushed voices, a sacred event that only happened once in a lifetime. As Naima took in the sight, a shiver of awe passed through her. The baobab seemed to be alive with its own energy, pulsing with a quiet strength, and she felt that same energy settle within her, wrapping her in a calm determination. Drawing closer to the baobab, Naima knelt, her fingers grazing the rough, warm bark. She whispered a silent greeting, feeling the tree's presence as if it were an elder watching over her, understanding her without words. She took a deep breath, the air filled with the faint, earthy scent of the blossoms, mingling with the smell of damp earth and salt from the distant sea. This was the same tree where she had once sat with Mzee Juma, learning from his quiet wisdom, absorbing the stories and traditions that he had guarded with a reverence she was only beginning to understand. Naima stayed there, breathing in the stillness, feeling the moment expand as if the tree itself had drawn time to a standstill. She let her thoughts drift, her memories of Mzee Juma mingling with the sights and sounds around her. She remembered his calm presence, the way he would sit with her in silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had rarely spoken, but each time he did, his words were laced with the weight of a life deeply lived, of a bond with the sea and the earth that went beyond mere understanding. Mzee Juma had been more than a mentor, he had been a bridge to a world Naima had felt a longing for but hadn't known how to find. Now beneath the baobab she felt closer to him than ever, as if his spirit lingered in the roots, watching over her, guiding her. The sound of footsteps approached, light and respectful, pulling her gently from her thoughts. She didn't turn but remained with her hand resting on the tree, feeling its strength seep into her bones. The footsteps stopped just behind her, and after a brief pause she heard a soft voice, barely more than a whisper. "It is time, Naima." The voice belonged to Anaya, the village elder, a woman of few words and sharp, perceptive eyes. Naima nodded without looking up, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She rose to her feet, brushing off the dust from her dress, and turned to face Anaya, who studied her with a gaze that seemed to pierce through her, as if searching for something hidden within. The elder's face was a map of lines etched by time, each wrinkle a testament to the years she had lived, the wisdom she carried. Without a word, Anaya gestured for Naima to follow. They walked together in silence through the winding paths of the village, each step drawing Naima deeper into the heart of the community. She could feel the eyes of the villagers on her, silent and watchful, as if they too understood the significance of this day. Mothers gathered their children close, men paused in their work, and the younger ones looked on with wide, curious eyes. Naima met their gazes briefly, offering them a quiet smile, her own heart racing yet steady, filled with a calm she could not explain. They reached the center of the village, where the other elders had gathered in a loose circle, their faces solemn, their eyes reflecting both warmth and anticipation. Naima took her place in the center, feeling the weight of their gazes upon her. She stood there, tall and unflinching, her hands resting at her sides, her fingers grazing the fabric of her dress as she steadied herself. Anaya stepped forward, holding in her hands a kanga, a beautifully woven cloth adorned with intricate patterns in deep shades of blue and earth brown. The cloth had belonged to Mzee Juma, and Naima's breath caught as she recognized it. Anaya held it out to her, and Naima accepted it reverently, feeling the soft weight of the fabric settle in her hands like a silent blessing. She draped it over her shoulders, the cloth enveloping her in a warmth that felt like an embrace, a piece of Mzee Juma's spirit woven into its threads. The elder's voice was soft yet carried with it a quiet authority that filled the air around them. This cloth belonged to Mzee Juma, a man who was one with the land and sea, who walked among us as our guide and protector. Today, Naima, we recognize in you the same spirit, the same love for our land, for our people. Naima's chest tightened as she listened, her gaze steady on Anaya's face. She felt each word sink into her, grounding her, connecting her not just to Mzee Juma but to the village itself, to the stories and traditions that had shaped it. She felt as if she was standing at the intersection of past and future, a bridge between the world she had once known and the one she was now a part of. You are now the guardian of our stories, of our wisdom, of the baobab and the land we call home, Anaya continued, her voice filled with a calm strength. Just as Mzee Juma watched over us, you will walk these paths, speak with our children, and hold close the memories of those who came before. Naima lowered her gaze, humbled by the weight of the role she was being given. She felt the silent approval of the elders, sensed the unspoken bond that was forming between them, a trust that had been earned not through words but through the quiet understanding that had grown over her time in the village. She looked around, meeting the eyes of each elder in turn, feeling the strength of their silent support. Then, as the first rays of full daylight broke over the trees, Anaya stepped back, her gaze softened with pride and a touch of something that resembled affection. The elders closed the circle around Naima, each placing a hand upon her shoulders, a quiet gesture of solidarity and blessing. She felt the warmth of their hands, their touch a silent promise that she was not alone, that they would walk with her, that she was part of something larger, a force that extended beyond herself. For a long moment they stood together in silence, the morning air filled with the soft sounds of the village coming to life, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant cry of seabirds. Naima closed her eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over her, the quiet strength of the elders flowing into her like a river, filling her with a resolve she had never felt before. When the elders finally stepped back, Naima opened her eyes, feeling as though she was seeing the village anew. The paths, the huts, the people, all of it felt different, imbued with a warmth and familiarity that wrapped around her heart. She belonged here now, not just as an outsider who had found her way, but as part of the village, part of its very soul. As she returned to the baobab, the kanga draped over her shoulders, Naima felt a deep peace settle within her. She knelt beneath the tree, pressing her palm against the earth, grounding herself in the soil, the life force of the land. She whispered a quiet promise, one spoken to the baobab, to Mzee Juma's spirit, to the village, and to herself. The morning sun rose higher, casting a golden light over the village, illuminating her with a gentle glow. Naima took a deep breath, her heart filled with gratitude, with purpose, with a love that reached beyond herself, a love that had taken root in the land, in the people, in the legacy she had been given. And in the silence, with the baobab as her witness, Naima began her journey as the guardian of the village, her life forever intertwined with its stories, its people, and the ancient rhythms that bound them all. As dusk settled over the village, casting a soft, rosy glow across the land, Naima felt an anticipatory stillness around her, as though even the trees and the ground beneath her feet were holding their breath. The air was cool, touched by the faint scent of the sea mingling with the earthy fragrance of the baobab tree, and Naima could feel the weight of the night ceremony resting on her shoulders, drawing her towards something she both knew and didn't fully understand. She had been called to the baobab tree by Anaya, the village elder, to participate in a ritual, one she had only heard about in passing but now felt was bound to her very soul. Naima walked slowly, each step taken with a reverence that came naturally in the presence of the ancient tree. The baobab stood like a silent sentinel, its roots firmly entwined with the earth, reaching deep, as if to hold on to all the memories it had absorbed over the centuries. Its trunk rose solid and wide, gnarled with age, and its branches stretched outward, silhouetted against the fading light of dusk. The rare blossoms dotted its branches in ethereal clusters, their white petals glowing faintly, as if holding on to the last vestiges of daylight. Gathered under the baobab were the elders of the village, each one standing in a loose circle, their faces etched with lines that mirrored the history of the land. Anaya, the village elder, stood at the center, her posture straight despite her years, her gaze sharp yet warm as she watched Naima approach. Her movements were unhurried, her steps soft and measured, as if she too was stepping into a realm of timelessness, a place where past and future merged. The elders turned to look at Naima as she arrived, their expressions calm and solemn, each pair of eyes reflecting both welcome and expectation. She felt a surge of humility as she met their gazes. These were the men and women who had guided the village through countless seasons, who had seen births, marriages and passings, who held within them the wisdom of lives fully lived. And now they were here for her, inviting her into a space that felt sacred, not only in its traditions but in the connection it forged between them all. As she took her place within the circle, Naima sensed the unity that bound the elders. They had gathered without speaking, drawn by a silent understanding that did not require words, each of them anchored in the moment, each one a part of the village's heartbeat. She felt the faint pulse of that rhythm beneath her feet, as if the very earth itself were aware of what was happening. The baobab, too, seemed to resonate with the energy of the gathering, its thick, ancient roots pulsing with a life force that flowed into the soil and spread outward, a web of connection that linked each person present. Anaya raised her hand slightly, signaling the beginning of the ritual. She held a cloth in her hands, a kanga woven in deep, earthen colors, its pattern simple yet powerful, and in the fading light it seemed to shimmer with a life of its own. This was Mzee Juma's kanga, Naima realized with a pang of emotion, recognizing the familiar design that she had seen him wear countless times. He had worn it during their conversations by the sea, wrapped in it when he walked the village paths, his presence quiet yet firm, a figure deeply intertwined with the village. And now, in Anaya's hands, it had become something more, an emblem of his legacy, a link to his memory, a piece of him offered to her. Anaya stepped forward and unfolded the kanga, her movements deliberate, each gesture infused with a quiet grace. She approached Naima, holding the cloth out as though presenting her with something sacred, something that held within it the spirit of Mzee Juma, and perhaps in some way the spirit of the land itself. Naima extended her hands, feeling the cloth settle softly into her palms. She traced its texture with her fingers, the woven fibers rough yet warm, as though they carried with them the strength and warmth of the man who had once worn it. As Naima draped the kanga over her shoulders, a hush fell over the circle, and she felt a shift within herself, a quiet acknowledgement that this was more than a piece of cloth. It was a mantle, a weight she was willingly taking on, and with it came the memories, the traditions, the wisdom of Mzee Juma. Her heart beat slowly, almost reverently, and she felt herself being drawn deeper into the moment, grounding herself in the ancient soil beneath her, in the steady gaze of the elders, and in the towering presence of the baobab. The elders' faces softened, their expressions touched by a quiet pride, a silent approval that required no words. They stood as witnesses, each of them connected to her, each of them offering their strength and support through their presence alone. Naima felt their acceptance like a warmth that radiated outward, filling the air around them, binding them all in an unspoken promise that transcended any individual life. Anaya moved back to her place in the circle, her gaze still steady on Naima. She extended her hands towards the ground, scooping up a handful of earth, rich and dark, still cool from the fading touch of twilight. She raised her hands toward Naima, offering the earth as a symbol of the village's foundation, a reminder that all things come from and return to the soil. Naima took a small pinch of the earth, pressing it gently into her palm, feeling its roughness, its weight, as she let it settle into her skin. The earth was an anchor, a reminder of the continuity of life, of the generations who had walked this land before her. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting herself sink fully into the experience, feeling the presence of the elders, the rootedness of the baobab, and the pulse of the land beneath her. She could feel the spirit of Mzee Juma among them, woven into the fabric of the ceremony, his memory lingering like a quiet song that played only for those who knew how to listen. It was as though he were there, standing beside her, his gaze on her, proud yet serene, passing on his role to her, trusting her to carry forward the traditions he had cherished. Anaya began to speak, her voice low and steady, each word resonating with the power of someone who had lived a life deeply connected to the land and its people. She spoke of the baobab tree, of how it had stood through countless seasons, sheltering the village, watching over them as they lived, loved and lost. She spoke of the roots that delved deep into the earth, reaching for water, for sustenance, much as the village reached for the wisdom and stories that sustained it. The roots of this tree, she said softly, are like the roots that bind us to each other, to this land. They hold us steady, even in times of drought, even when storms rage. They carry the memory of those who came before us, and offer it to those who come after. Naima felt the truth of Anaya's words resonate within her, felt it as something she had always known yet hadn't fully understood until now. She was no longer a visitor, an outsider seeking to belong. She was now part of this place, tied to its past and its future, a bridge between what had been and what would be. Anaya raised her hand, signaling for each elder to come forward, one by one. They approached Naima, each holding a small token, a shell, a stone, a handful of dried herbs, symbols of the lives they had led, of the memories they carried. Each elder placed their token in Naima's hands, their faces solemn, their gazes filled with respect and understanding. She accepted each item with care, feeling the weight of their history settle over her, feeling herself become part of their story, of the village's story. When all the tokens had been offered, the elders stepped back, forming a circle around Naima. They stood in silence, their eyes upon her, their presence a testament to the bond that now connected them all. Naima felt a surge of gratitude, a deep, abiding respect for the lives of these men and women, for the experiences they had endured, for the strength and love they had given to the village. In the stillness she felt something shift within her, a realization that this ceremony was not merely a formality. It was a binding, a promise between her and the village, between her and the land, between her and Mzee Juma's spirit. She would carry the memories of these people, the stories of those who had come before, and one day she too would pass them on, ensuring that they lived on, as enduring as the baobab itself. The final light of dusk faded, casting the circle into a gentle twilight, and as the first stars appeared overhead, Anaya nodded, a slight but powerful gesture that sealed the ritual. Naima stood there, the kanga around her shoulders, the tokens of the elders cradled in her hands, her heart filled with a quiet, solemn joy. She understood in that moment that she had become part of something eternal, something that would carry her forward even as it held her rooted to the earth. With a final look at the baobab, Naima bowed her head, silently thanking the tree, the elders and Mzee Juma for guiding her to this moment. As she lifted her head, she met the eyes of each elder in turn, feeling their strength flow into her, their lives now interwoven with hers in a bond that could never be broken. The ritual complete, the elders turned and began to disperse, moving back toward their homes in quiet reflection. Naima watched them go, her heart swelling with a love she had never known before, a love that embraced not just the people, but the land, the history, and the future they all shared. Left alone beneath the baobab, Naima closed her eyes, feeling the night settle around her, the gentle whisper of the leaves like a lullaby, a song that belonged to her now, that would live within her and guide her for as long as she walked the village paths. The night air was cool against her skin, the earth solid beneath her feet, and she felt a profound peace, a sense of belonging that was as deep and steady as the roots of the great baobab itself. The afternoon sun hung high, casting a gentle warmth over the village, and the sound of children's laughter drifted through the air, mingling with the songs of distant seabirds and the faint rustle of palm fronds. Naima watched as the children darted between the huts, their steps light, their voices filled with unrestrained joy. They moved with the energy and curiosity of the young, each one a small spark of life brightening the village, yet unaware of the legacy they would one day inherit. Naima stood at the edge of the village square, watching them with a quiet smile, feeling both a tenderness and a sense of responsibility settle within her. She had grown accustomed to her role as the village's new guardian, yet every day brought new moments that humbled her. Today was one such day. She had been entrusted with the task of teaching the village's children, to share with them the knowledge and stories she herself had once learned from Mzee Juma, a responsibility that filled her with both pride and awe. It was not just knowledge she would be passing on, but a way of seeing the world, a connection to the land and the sea, to life itself. With a silent gesture, she called the children over. They gathered around her eagerly, their wide eyes filled with curiosity and excitement, the innocence of their faces a reminder of her own childhood, though her memories were of another place, far from the rhythms of this village. As she led them toward the great baobab tree, she could feel their anticipation, their whispers and giggles filling the air like a song, each voice a note in the symphony of village life. The baobab tree loomed ahead, its roots spreading wide and deep, anchoring it to the earth in a way that made it seem both timeless and wise. Its thick branches stretched out like open arms, sheltering those beneath it with a canopy of green leaves that danced in the breeze. To the children, the tree was as familiar as the village paths, yet as they followed Naima, a hush fell over them, as if they sensed that today the tree held something special, something beyond its usual mysteries. Naima knelt down at the base of the tree, and the children gathered close, settling into a circle around her. They sat cross-legged, fidgeting and whispering, until one by one they stilled, their attention drawn to her like flowers turning toward the sun. She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze soft yet steady, letting them feel the weight of the moment, the importance of the knowledge she was about to share. With slow, careful movements, Naima reached into the small woven bag she carried at her side, drawing out a handful of shells, smooth stones, and small, delicate pieces of driftwood. These were items she had gathered with Mzee Juma, treasures of the shore and the sea, each one a silent testament to the lessons he had taught her. She held them in her hands, allowing the children to see the simple beauty of each piece, their eyes wide with wonder as they took in the worn surfaces, the delicate patterns, and the soft colors that seemed to reflect the hues of the ocean. "These are gifts from the sea," she began, her voice soft yet carrying an undercurrent of strength that stilled even the smallest whispers. "Each one holds a story, just as we do. The sea has shaped these stones, washed over these shells, smoothed these pieces of driftwood, each wave, each tide, leaving its mark." The children leaned forward, entranced by her words, as if the very air around them had stilled, drawn into the story she was beginning to weave. She could see their young minds turning, their imaginations stretching to picture the journey of each shell and stone, carried by the waves, touched by the sand, shaped by forces larger than they could yet understand. Naima placed the items gently on the ground between them, letting them rest on the earth, a reminder that they, too, were part of this world, shaped by the land and the sea. She picked up one of the stones, its surface smooth and dark, worn by years of contact with sand and water. She held it up for the children to see, turning it slowly in her hands so that the sunlight glinted off its polished surface. "This stone," she said, "is like the people of our village. It has been shaped by its surroundings, by everything it has encountered. Like us, it holds memories, carries pieces of its journey, even if we cannot see them. When we walk on the shore, we are walking among these memories, feeling the stories that have come before us." She handed the stone to the nearest child, who held it carefully, almost reverently, passing it around the circle. Each child took a moment to feel its weight, its smoothness, its cool touch against their skin. For a moment, Naima let the silence linger, letting them absorb the stone's presence, allowing them to sense the deeper meaning it held. The children's faces were serious, their small hands holding the stone as if it was something precious, something alive. Once the stone had made its way around the circle, Naima picked up a shell, its surface ridged and slightly chipped, the color a faded shade of pink that glowed softly in the sunlight. She held it up, letting the children see its delicate, intricate beauty, the way its ridges curved like waves frozen in time. "This shell," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "once belonged to a creature of the sea. It was its home, its shelter, its protection. Just like this shell, we each have a place we come from, a place that keeps us safe, where we find comfort." She paused, letting the children take in her words. They watched her closely, their faces serious, absorbing the idea that they, too, had a place of belonging, a home as sacred and as necessary as the shell was to the creature that once lived within it. Slowly, she handed the shell to the nearest child, and again they passed it around, each small hand holding it carefully, their fingers tracing the ridges, feeling the history embedded in its form. Naima watched them with a quiet pride, sensing that even in their youth, they were beginning to understand, to feel the connection between themselves and the natural world, to sense the deeper truths she was trying to convey. Finally, she reached for a piece of driftwood, its surface smooth, its shape twisted and unique, a testament to the journey it had taken through the water. She held it out for the children to see, watching as their eyes followed the curves, the worn patches, the places where the wood had been smoothed by the endless caress of the waves. "This piece of wood has traveled far," she said softly. "It has been carried by the sea, shaped by the tides, until it found its way here. Like this driftwood, each of us is on a journey. We will be shaped by the people we meet, by the places we go, by the things we experience." As she handed the driftwood to the children, they took it as they had the other items, passing it with care, sensing its fragility, its history. They held it with reverence, as if they understood that they too were a part of this great cycle, that they too were shaped by forces both seen and unseen. When the driftwood had returned to her hands, Naima set all three items, the stone, the shell and the driftwood, on the ground before her, letting them rest together as symbols of the stories, the connections, the lives that made up the village. She looked at the children, her gaze warm and steady, letting them feel the weight of her words, the depth of her message. "These are not just things we find on the shore," she said, her voice soft but strong. "They are reminders. They remind us that we are connected to each other, to the land, to the sea, to the stories of those who came before us. We are all part of something greater, something that holds us and guides us, even when we cannot see it." The children sat in silence, their young faces thoughtful, their eyes reflecting a newfound understanding, a quiet reverence for the world around them. Naima watched them, feeling a swell of pride, a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. She knew that this moment would stay with them, that they would carry it forward, that one day they would pass on these same stories, these same lessons, to their own children, to the generations yet to come. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the village, Naima gathered the stone, the shell, and the driftwood back into her bag. The children rose, their faces filled with a quiet wonder, and she led them back toward the heart of the village, their small voices breaking into whispers and laughter as they walked. They held the memory of the afternoon close, a gentle reminder of the beauty and wisdom woven into their lives, into the land and sea that surrounded them. And as Naima watched them go, she knew that she had fulfilled her role, that she had passed on not just knowledge but a piece of her heart, a piece of Mzee Juma's spirit, a piece of the village's soul. She stood there, under the baobab tree, feeling the roots of the earth beneath her feet, feeling the timeless connection that bound them all together, and she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. In the days that followed, Naima slipped naturally into her role within the village, her movements guided by a quiet sense of purpose that had taken root deep within her. Her days were a steady rhythm, woven into the fabric of village life, each task as familiar as breathing, yet imbued with a new depth that gave each moment significance. She had become a part of the village in a way that felt ancient and sacred, as though she were carrying forward a legacy far greater than herself. The villagers, too, had come to regard her differently. Mothers greeted her with soft smiles, while elders nodded in silent approval as she passed. Children followed her in quiet curiosity, drawn to her presence like young shoots stretching toward the sun. They sensed, perhaps instinctively, that she carried the wisdom of Mzee Juma and a love for the land that resonated with the heart of the village itself. Each morning, Naima rose with the first light, feeling the cool dawn air on her skin as she walked the narrow paths, greeting the villagers who were already beginning their day. She helped carry water from the well, her hands strong and steady on the heavy wooden buckets. She joined the women as they prepared meals, her laughter mingling with theirs, the simple joy of shared work binding them together. And in the evenings, as the sun sank low, she walked to the shore to watch the waves, a ritual that grounded her in the rhythms of the sea, just as Mzee Juma had once done. The baobab tree had become her sanctuary, a place where she felt Mzee Juma's presence most keenly. Its branches stretched wide, sheltering her as she sat beneath it, her fingers tracing the rough bark, her mind filled with memories. The tree had stood witness to countless generations, its roots reaching deep into the earth, and Naima felt her own roots growing alongside it, binding her to this place. She knew, with a quiet certainty, that this tree was her link to the past and to the future, a reminder of the legacy she had inherited and the one she would pass on. With each passing day, she felt herself growing into her role, finding strength in the knowledge that she was part of something larger, a continuum that held the lives and memories of all who had come before her. The villagers came to her now for guidance, for comfort, for the simple reassurance of her presence. They shared their worries, their joys, their stories, trusting her with pieces of themselves as naturally as they breathed. And Naima listened, offering words of solace or advice, her voice carrying the wisdom she had absorbed over her months in the village. One evening, as the village gathered around a small fire, Naima noticed the elder Anaya watching her from across the flames, her gaze steady and thoughtful. In that moment, Naima felt the weight of her role, the quiet responsibility she had taken on. She understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that she was not merely filling a place left by Mzee Juma but creating her own path, her own legacy. This was her chapter, her time to carry forward the spirit of the village, to nurture it and pass it on. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks into the night sky, and Naima sat in silence, absorbing the warmth, the companionship of the villagers around her, and the timelessness of the moment. She felt a deep peace settle over her, a feeling of home that wrapped around her like a blanket. She was no longer a visitor or a student, she was woven into the village's story, a part of its pulse, its soul. As she looked around at the faces illuminated by the firelight, Naima felt a swell of gratitude, a love that reached beyond words. This place, these people, they were her family now. She was their guardian, their connection to the past and their bridge to the future. The journey she had begun when she first arrived in the village had brought her to a place of belonging she had not known she needed, a purpose that filled her with a quiet, unbreakable strength. In the silence that stretched beneath the stars, Naima knew that her life had taken on a new rhythm, one that would carry her forward. She felt the continuity of life, the unbroken thread that tied her to the land, to the village, to the people who had come before her. And as she sat by the fire, surrounded by the warmth of the village, she knew that she was ready to step fully into this new chapter, a chapter that was hers alone to shape. The days grew longer, marked by the steady warmth of the sun that seemed to breathe life into every corner of the village. Naima had been carrying a quiet secret within her, one she had come to recognize slowly, like the soft dawn light spreading across the sky. She could feel it in the gentle weight beneath her heart, in the subtle changes that seemed to echo through her body, a delicate rhythm that mirrored her own heartbeat. She was carrying a child, a new life growing within her, a part of herself that connected her to the village, and to Mzee Juma's legacy in a way she had never anticipated. The realization had come to her one morning as she sat by the shore, her feet buried in the warm sand, her eyes tracing the line where the sea met the sky. She had felt an unfamiliar flutter, soft and insistent, as if the sea itself had whispered to her of this life within. It was a moment of quiet revelation, a realization that had wrapped around her like the warmth of the sun. Her fingers rested on her belly, and a calm assurance filled her, as steady and unbreakable as the tides. As her pregnancy progressed, the villagers began to notice the gentle changes in her, though Naima herself never spoke of it. Mothers would glance at her with knowing smiles, their eyes warm with understanding, as if they saw in her the continuation of a story they knew by heart. The children watched her with curiosity, sensing something different in her steps, in the softness of her gaze, though they could not yet name it. And the elders offered her silent nods of approval, as though welcoming her even more deeply into the heart of the village. Naima found herself drawn more often to the baobab tree, its thick roots anchoring her, offering her a place of quiet reflection. Beneath its canopy, she felt the presence of Mzee Juma, as if he were watching over her, his spirit intertwined with the land, with the tree, with the life growing within her. She rested her hand on the rough bark, grounding herself in the solid strength of the tree, feeling its age, its wisdom. In those moments she felt that her child was already part of the village, a part of the cycle of life that pulsed through the roots of the baobab and the waves of the sea. As the seasons turned, the life within her grew, and Naima moved through her days with a quiet purpose. She continued her tasks, tending to the village needs, speaking to the children, offering guidance and comfort to those who sought her out. The villagers had come to see her as a guardian, a bridge between the old and the new, and with the child growing within her, this role deepened. She could feel the weight of their trust, the silent blessings that followed her as she walked the village paths. It was as though the entire village, the land, and the sea itself were cradling her, holding her and her unborn child in a gentle embrace. In the quiet of the night, Naima would often sit alone, listening to the soft sounds of the village settling into sleep, the distant murmur of the waves, the rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. Her hand rested on her belly, and she would close her eyes, feeling the life within her, feeling her child's heartbeat as an echo of her own. She spoke to her child in soft whispers, telling stories of the sea, of the land, of the people who had become her family. She shared with the child the legacy of Mzee Juma, the wisdom of the baobab, the love that bound the village together. In these moments she felt as though she were passing on a heritage, a legacy that her child would carry forward, a continuation of the story that had begun long before her. And as the time drew near, the villagers gathered in quiet anticipation, offering her gentle smiles, small gifts and blessings. Mothers brought her herbs for strength, old remedies passed down through generations. Elders offered her silent prayers, their eyes filled with a solemn joy, as if they saw in her child the promise of continuity, the enduring spirit of the village. Naima accepted each offering with gratitude, feeling the warmth of their love, the strength of their hopes for her and her child. Finally, in the soft light of dawn, when the village was wrapped in the delicate hush of morning, her child was born beneath the baobab tree. Naima had chosen this spot, sensing that the tree, the earth, and the spirit of Mzee Juma would guide her, hold her steady in this moment. The birth was quiet, wrapped in a profound stillness, the air thick with reverence as the first cry of her child echoed softly beneath the ancient branches. The villagers, drawn by an unspoken call, gathered at a respectful distance, watching with awe as the new life entered the world. Naima held her child close, feeling the warmth of the tiny body against her chest, the softness of skin that seemed to carry the scent of the earth and sea. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from pain or exhaustion, but from a love that was as boundless as the sky above. She looked down at her child, at the eyes that blinked up at her with a gaze both new and ancient, and she knew that this was her purpose, her gift to the village, a continuation of the life that had sustained them all. The villagers approached slowly, one by one, each offering a quiet blessing, their voices hushed as they welcomed the child, a new link in the chain that bound them all together. Naima felt their presence, their love, as they gathered around her, forming a circle beneath the baobab, their faces lit by the first rays of morning light. In that moment, Naima felt the presence of Mzee Juma, felt his spirit wrap around her and her child like a gentle breeze. She knew that he was there, watching over them, guiding her, his legacy living on in the child she held. And as the sun rose, casting a warm glow over the village, Naima felt the quiet assurance that she was exactly where she was meant to be, her life and her child's life woven into the heart of the village, into the roots of the baobab, into the unbroken cycle of life that would carry them all forward. The days after her child's birth brought a deep stillness to Naima's heart, a grounded peace that settled within her like roots burrowing into the earth. She felt as if the village itself was holding her, a quiet understanding in the glances of the villagers, a silent support offered in every nod and gentle smile. Her role as guardian had become inseparable from her identity, woven into her spirit as seamlessly as the pulse of the sea that beat against the shore. With each dawn, Naima rose to greet the day, carrying her child close as she moved through the village. Her steps took her from one family to the next, her presence as natural as the morning light spilling over the land. She helped where she was needed, lifting water from the well, mending torn fishing nets, sharing her stories with those who sought her guidance. The villagers had come to regard her with a reverence she had only seen given to Mzee Juma, a quiet respect that spoke to the trust they had placed in her, the place she had come to hold in their lives. The baobab tree had become her touchstone, a place she returned to each evening as the sun slipped below the horizon. Beneath its wide branches, she found comfort in the presence of the tree, its roots as steady and unyielding as the role she had taken on. She would sit there, her child in her arms, feeling the cool bark beneath her fingertips, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves above. Here, she felt closest to Mzee Juma, his memory like a quiet echo that reached her through the silence, filling her with strength. The village children gathered around her often, their eyes bright with curiosity as they settled beside her under the tree. They listened as she shared the stories Mzee Juma had once told her, tales of the sea's mysteries, of the spirits that danced in the waves, of the land that held them all. She watched as their faces lit with wonder, as they leaned forward, drawn into the world of legends and lore, their imaginations stretching to touch the edges of a reality they were only beginning to understand. She could see in their faces a spark of understanding, a recognition that they were part of something much larger than themselves, part of the ancient pulse that ran through the village and into the earth. The villagers came to her not only for stories but for counsel, for her steady presence, which had become a source of comfort in times of uncertainty. She offered them guidance, listening deeply, her words carrying the quiet wisdom she had absorbed from Mzee Juma and from the land itself. She spoke rarely, yet when she did, her words seemed to settle into the hearts of those around her, bringing them peace, grounding them in the reality that they too were held by the land, by the sea, by the village they called home. As the seasons passed, Naima's role grew to encompass rituals that marked the village's rhythms. She led the gatherings under the baobab tree during the harvest season, where the villagers would come together in celebration, offering thanks to the land that sustained them. She guided the young ones as they took their first steps into adulthood, their initiation marked by a ceremony that honored the life they were stepping into and the responsibilities they would carry forward. She presided over weddings, over births, and even the rare funerals, standing beside families as they offered their loved ones back to the earth, reminding them of the unbroken circle that bound them all. There was no need for words to solidify her role. It was a presence that grew with each passing day, a natural extension of her love for the village and the people within it. She became a fixture of the village, like the baobab, her life intertwined with theirs, her spirit woven into the fabric of their lives. Each person who approached her, each child who listened to her stories, each elder who nodded in quiet approval, all were pieces of the legacy she was building, a legacy as steady and enduring as the land beneath her feet. In the quiet of the night, Naima would often walk the village paths alone, her child sleeping soundly in her arms, the stars casting their soft light over her. She felt the strength of the village, the continuity of its traditions, its silent resilience, in every step she took. She knew that she was not alone in her role. She carried the spirit of those who had come before her, and she was surrounded by the lives of those who stood beside her. She was a guardian, a keeper of stories, a protector of the village's soul, yet she was also simply Naima, a woman with love in her heart and a place to call home. And as she looked down at her child, sleeping peacefully in the moonlight, she felt a sense of fulfillment, a quiet joy that settled over her like a soft blanket. She knew that she was carrying forward a legacy that would live on, a legacy she would one day pass to her child, to the next generation, ensuring that the spirit of the village, the essence of Mzee Juma, would never fade. In the end, Naima's role as guardian was not a title or a position, it was a way of life, a deep and abiding love for the land, for the people, for the rhythms that bound them all together. She had become the beating heart of the village, her life a testament to the unbroken cycle that flowed from one generation to the next. And as she stood beneath the stars with the baobab tree as her witness, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, her place secure, her spirit forever intertwined with the village that had given her purpose, love, and a home. Under the soft haze of morning light, the seasons began their quiet shift, each change almost imperceptible at first, a sharper chill in the dawn air, the scent of damp earth lingering longer as Naima walked the village paths. It was as though the land itself was drawing a deep breath, settling into a slower rhythm, and Naima felt this shift echo in her own heart. Since the birth of her child, the village had woven her even more tightly into its fabric, her role expanding with each passing day, a mantle she wore with both pride and humility. The early risers had begun to regard her differently, their expressions filled with something beyond respect, a silent acknowledgement that Naima had become not just a part of their lives, but an essential thread in the fabric of the village's existence. She sensed their unspoken trust, a willingness to place their worries and hopes in her hands, just as they once had with Mzee Juma. Every day, as she carried her child close to her chest, her presence brought a comfort as natural as the daybreak or the evening's hush. She had become both witness and keeper of their stories, and with the changing seasons she felt the weight of her responsibilities deepen. In the mornings, Naima would begin her rounds, moving through the village like the sun's light, touching each corner, each household with her presence. She would start with the mothers, joining them in their quiet routines, carrying water from the well, washing vegetables in the cool stream that ran along the edge of the village, her hands quick and practiced. They shared no words about her role, but the women would pause as she passed, giving her a nod or a soft smile, as though acknowledging the place she had earned among them. Children gathered around her, drawn by her calmness, whispering and laughing as they trailed behind her. With each passing season, Naima became less of an enigma and more of a steady presence, someone who was always there, like the roots of the baobab tree. Her mornings often led her to the village's edge, where she would meet the elders as they inspected the fields, assessing the health of the crops and the readiness of the soil for the coming harvest. She listened quietly, her gaze sharp, her mind absorbing the small details, the way the earth responded to the sun, the signs the elders read in the shifting patterns of the winds. It was as though each season was another chapter, a reminder of the land's rhythm, and Naima found herself sinking deeper into this cycle. She knew the patterns now, the quiet signs that signaled the end of one phase and the beginning of another. She could feel the earth beneath her, the land's energy running through her veins, binding her even more closely to the village. Her tasks, once simple and routine, now held a weight that went beyond their practical purpose. When she helped to repair a broken fence or lent her hands to mend fishing nets, Naima felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of fulfillment she could not have imagined before. She began to understand that every small act, every moment of care she gave to the land and the people, was a continuation of the legacy left by Mzee Juma. It was as if his spirit walked with her, guiding her hands, filling her with a steady resilience that grew stronger with each task she undertook. One afternoon, Naima found herself by the riverbank, helping one of the village's younger women weave a new mat for the coming ceremonies. As her fingers worked the fibers, twisting and knotting, she thought of Mzee Juma's quiet wisdom, the way he had once taught her to listen to the land's pulse, to feel its quiet rhythm beneath her feet. She glanced at the young woman beside her, noticing the concentration etched on her face, the quiet determination in her hands. Naima could see her own younger self reflected there, a mixture of eagerness and reverence, a desire to understand the village's ways and to contribute to its life. As they worked, Naima felt her role shift subtly, evolving from that of a learner to a guide, from a listener to a silent teacher. She realized that, just as Mzee Juma had once passed his knowledge to her, she now held the responsibility of passing it forward. As the day faded, Naima returned to the center of the village, where the setting sun cast long shadows over the gathering villagers, drawing them close as the evening chill settled in. The young children, whose laughter had filled the day, gathered around her once more, their faces eager, waiting for the stories she would share. Under the sprawling branches of the baobab, Naima wove tales of the past, of the ancestors who had walked the same paths, touched the same earth, and breathed the same air. She spoke of the stars, of the sea, and of the ancient rhythms that bound them all together. Her voice, low and steady, filled the space around them, settling over the children like a soft blanket. They listened with wide eyes, their imaginations alight, their minds stretching to grasp the vastness of the stories Naima offered. In their faces she saw a glimpse of the future, the next generation of the village, each one a vessel of the stories, each one carrying a piece of the village's soul within them. Days passed, and the rhythm of Naima's life became a steady, grounding force, one that shaped the village as much as it shaped her. She felt herself becoming woven into the rituals, the gatherings, and the unspoken understanding that held the community together. Her presence brought a quiet reassurance to the elders, who now entrusted her with tasks that once would have fallen solely to them. They sought her out for guidance, asking her opinion on matters both large and small, and Naima sensed the subtle shift in their respect for her, a respect rooted not only in her connection to Mzee Juma, but in the trust she had earned in her own right. In the evenings, as the last light faded from the sky, Naima would often sit beneath the baobab tree, her child nestled against her chest, breathing softly in sleep. She would watch the stars emerge one by one, filling the sky with their quiet brilliance, each point of light a reminder of the ancestors, of the countless lives that had come before her. The tree's presence was a steady, unyielding force, a reminder of the continuity that bound the village's past, present, and future. Naima would rest her hand on its rough bark, feeling the texture of its ancient skin beneath her fingers, a silent promise that she would carry forward its legacy, just as it had carried the village through countless generations. As the seasons turned and the days grew shorter, Naima found herself increasingly called upon to perform small rituals, gestures that seemed simple but held profound meaning for the villagers. She would place offerings at the edge of the fields before the harvest, honoring the land and giving thanks for its bounty. She would bless the nets before the fishermen set out, a gesture of protection and gratitude. These acts, though small, grounded her, binding her even more deeply to the land, to the rhythms that governed their lives. She felt Mzee Juma's spirit with her, a steady presence that guided her hands, her heart, her mind. The weight of her responsibilities no longer felt like a burden, but like an anchor, grounding her, giving her life a purpose that stretched beyond herself. She knew that the village's future depended on the wisdom she carried, on the strength and resilience that she nurtured within herself. And as each day unfolded, she felt the legacy of Mzee Juma become her own, a gift she would one day pass on, ensuring that the stories, the traditions, and the love that bound them all would continue to flourish, as constant and enduring as the roots of the baobab tree. In the quiet of the night, with her child sleeping soundly in her arms, Naima felt a sense of peace that was as vast and deep as the land itself. She knew that her place was here, that her life was woven into the soul of the village, her heart forever bound to the people, the land, and the ancient rhythms that had guided them all. And as the stars watched over her, as steady and unchanging as the legacy she carried, Naima felt a deep, abiding love, a love that would hold her steady through all seasons, through all the challenges and joys that lay ahead. The first hint of the stranger's arrival came in the form of whispers carried on the morning breeze, snippets of conversation that reached Naima as she moved through her daily tasks. It was unusual for someone from outside to venture so far into the heart of their village. The paths leading in were known only to those who had lived on the land for generations, woven into the fabric of its rhythms and customs. Yet the villagers spoke of a lone traveller seen near the distant edge of the forest, making their way slowly but purposefully toward the village. Naima paused in her work, sensing the anticipation that spread through the village like ripples on a still pond. A traveller, someone from beyond the hills and rivers that bordered their world, was a rare occurrence, and their presence carried an air of mystery, a promise of stories and knowledge from distant lands. She could feel the quiet stirring of excitement in the children as they whispered and cast curious glances toward the forest's edge. Even the elders, whose expressions rarely betrayed emotion, seemed to carry a hint of curiosity in their eyes. By mid-morning, Naima joined a few villagers who had gathered along the main path to catch a glimpse of the visitor. She watched from a short distance, her child cradled against her, as the figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, their form coming into focus with each step. The traveller was a tall figure, draped in a dark cloak worn and faded by time and sun, their movements slow but steady. The cloak was adorned with intricate patterns unfamiliar to Naima, symbols and lines woven into the fabric, hinting at traditions and beliefs that belonged to lands she had never seen. As the traveller approached, Naima's gaze lingered on their face, marked by lines that spoke of countless journeys, days spent beneath unforgiving suns and nights under star-filled skies. Their skin was weathered, their eyes sharp, taking in the surroundings with a calm awareness, as though they saw not only the huts and people, but the spirit that bound the village together. In their gaze, Naima sensed a deep wisdom, an understanding that went beyond words, a quiet knowledge of paths that led beyond the edges of their world. The village elder, Anaya, stepped forward to greet the traveller, her gestures respectful and cautious, offering the formal greeting reserved for those who carried unknown wisdom. The traveller inclined their head, a brief acknowledgement, and then extended their hands, empty yet somehow full of meaning. Naima could see that, despite the stranger's presence, they had brought no gifts, no offerings, yet their very arrival seemed to be an offering, a silent promise of stories yet to be told, of knowledge that could not be held in material form. As Anaya welcomed the traveller into the village, Naima felt a faint stirring in her chest, a mix of curiosity and caution. She sensed the weight of the visitor's presence, the way their footsteps pressed into the earth as though they too were seeking something beyond mere shelter. It was a feeling Naima recognized, one she had experienced on her own journey into the village, the longing for connection, for a place to belong. The traveller's arrival reminded her of her first days in the village, the tentative steps she had taken, the quiet hopes she had carried with her, hidden yet persistent. Over the following days, the traveller became a familiar figure within the village, though they moved with an air of quiet independence, their interactions limited to respectful nods and small gestures of gratitude. Naima watched them from a distance, noting how they observed the villagers' routines, their gaze lingering on the children as they played, on the fishermen as they mended their nets, on the women as they gathered herbs and tended to the fields. It was as if the traveller was absorbing the village's essence, the unspoken language that bound them all, learning its patterns, its heartbeat. One afternoon, Naima found herself alone by the shore, watching the waves as they rolled in and out, the rhythm of the sea calming her, grounding her. She sensed movement nearby, and turned to see the traveller standing a short distance away, their gaze fixed on the horizon. Their presence was unintrusive, a quiet acknowledgement of her solitude, and yet Naima felt a strange kinship, a recognition of the unspoken bond between those who seek and those who watch. She said nothing, letting the silence speak for them both, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. The traveller reached down and picked up a small, smooth stone from the sand, holding it in their palm as if feeling its weight, its history. Naima watched them, her gaze drawn to the way they turned the stone over, studying its texture, its imperfections. In that simple gesture, she saw a reflection of her own connection to the land, the reverence she felt for the earth and the sea, for the stories embedded in every rock, every grain of sand. For a long time they stood together in silence, both of them watching the horizon, each absorbed in their own thoughts, yet somehow united in the moment. Naima felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet understanding that needed no words, no explanations. She knew that the traveller's journey had brought them here for a reason, and though she did not know what that reason was, she sensed that it held meaning, a purpose that would reveal itself in time. As the days passed, the traveller became a part of the village's landscape, their presence as natural as the trees and the rocks, as if they had always belonged. They offered no stories of their own, yet they listened intently when the villagers spoke, their eyes reflecting a quiet understanding that transcended language. Naima observed the way they blended into the rhythms of village life, adapting to the unspoken customs and rituals as if they were already familiar with them. One evening, as the villagers gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, the traveller sat quietly on the outskirts, their gaze fixed on the flames. Naima could feel the curiosity in the air, the villagers' subtle glances as they wondered about the stories the traveller might carry, the knowledge they had gathered on their journey. Yet the traveller remained silent, a quiet observer, their face illuminated by the flickering light, their expression calm and inscrutable. Naima felt a pull, an instinct that drew her toward the traveller. She settled beside them, her gaze following the flames as they danced and crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. She sensed the traveller's attention shift toward her, a gentle acknowledgement of her presence, a silent invitation. For a long time they sat together in silence, the fire casting shadows that flickered across their faces, the night air thick with the scent of burning wood, and the soft murmur of the villagers' voices. Finally, without speaking, the traveller reached into the folds of their cloak and withdrew a small, worn object, a shell, its surface weathered and smooth, the edges chipped and faded. They held it out to Naima, a gesture that was both offering and explanation, as though the shell held within it the essence of their journey, the countless miles they had travelled, the experiences etched into the lines of their face. Naima accepted the shell, feeling its weight in her hand, sensing the history it carried. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the smoothness of its surface, the roughness of its edges. In that moment she understood that the shell was more than a mere object. It was a fragment of the traveller's story, a piece of their life that they had chosen to share with her. She looked up, meeting their gaze, and saw in their eyes a depth of understanding, a quiet knowledge of journeys both taken and yet to be taken. As she held the shell, Naima felt a sense of connection that went beyond words, a bond forged not through conversation but through the simple act of sharing. She knew that the traveller's journey would continue, that their path would lead them away from the village in time, yet she felt no sadness. Instead, she felt a quiet gratitude, a recognition of the gift they had given her, not in the form of words or stories, but in the silent presence they had offered, the reminder that life itself was a journey, a series of moments strung together like the beads of a necklace, each one unique, each one precious. When the traveller finally departed, slipping away in the early dawn as silently as they had arrived, Naima felt their absence keenly, like a hollow space within her chest. Yet she knew that their presence had left an indelible mark on her, a subtle shift in her understanding of her role, of the world beyond the village. She stood beneath the baobab tree, the shell still held in her hand, feeling the rough bark beneath her fingers, grounding herself in the moment, in the place she called home. As the sun rose, casting its first light over the village, Naima felt a deep peace settle over her, a quiet assurance that her path was aligned with something greater, a rhythm that echoed through the land, through the sea, through the stories of those who had come before her and those who would come after. She placed the shell at the base of the baobab, a small offering, a symbol of the journey she had shared with the traveller, a reminder that every life was connected, every story a thread in the vast tapestry of existence. With a final glance at the horizon, Naima turned back to the village, her heart filled with gratitude, her spirit fortified by the traveller's silent wisdom. She knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, carrying forward the legacy of those who had walked before her, her life forever intertwined with the land, with the people, with the timeless rhythms that bound them all together. And as she walked, she felt the weight of the shell in her memory, a reminder of the distant places that lay beyond her world, yet somehow remained a part of her own journey. The storm arrived without warning, its presence announced by a thick, unnatural stillness that settled over the village like a held breath. The air grew heavy, dense with the scent of rain, and the sky darkened as though a shroud had been pulled over the land. Naima felt it before she saw it, a quiet rumbling in the distance, a low, rolling growl that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth itself. The villagers, sensing the change, lifted their heads, their expressions tense, their eyes scanning the horizon as they prepared for what they knew was coming. Naima stood in the village square, her heart beating in time with the distant thunder, her child held close to her chest. She watched as a dark wall of clouds gathered on the horizon, a roiling mass of shadow and light that moved with an eerie, unstoppable purpose. She had seen storms before, had felt the wind and rain lash against her skin, but this one felt different, like something alive, a force that demanded their attention, their respect. The first gusts of wind swept through the village, rustling the leaves of the great baobab tree and sending ripples through the tall grasses that surrounded the huts. The villagers moved quickly, gathering their children, securing their belongings, each one knowing instinctively what to do, their movements practiced and efficient. The elders directed the younger ones, their gestures calm but firm, guiding them toward the more sheltered parts of the village, the places where they would be safest. Naima joined them, her presence a steadying force, a silent reassurance in the face of the impending storm. The sky grew darker, the clouds swirling in angry spirals, their edges lit by flashes of lightning that split the sky with fierce, jagged lines. The wind picked up, howling through the village, tugging at the thatched roofs and rattling the walls of the huts. Naima could feel the air thickening around her, the pressure building as the storm drew nearer, its power palpable, its intentions clear. She steadied herself, feeling the earth beneath her feet, grounding herself in the solidity of the land, drawing strength from the deep-rooted presence of the baobab tree that loomed nearby, a silent sentinel against the oncoming fury. As the rain began to fall, Naima moved through the village, her steps sure and steady despite the chaos around her. She helped the villagers secure their belongings, tying down loose objects, reinforcing the roofs of the huts with additional thatch and rope. The children clung to their mothers, their wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and wonder, watching as the sky transformed above them, the clouds churning like waves in a stormy sea. Naima offered them quiet smiles, a comforting touch on their shoulders, her presence a balm against the rising anxiety that pulsed through the air. The storm hit with a force that shook the village to its core. The wind roared like a wild beast, tearing at the roofs, bending trees until their branches scraped against the ground, their roots straining against the earth. The rain fell in sheets, relentless, drumming against the huts, seeping through cracks and crevices, turning the ground beneath their feet to thick, sucking mud. The villagers huddled together in the shelters they had prepared, their faces lit only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the scene with an unearthly glow. Naima could feel the tension in the air, a collective fear that pulsed beneath the surface, the quiet understanding that they were at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. Yet she also felt a sense of resolve, a determination that ran like a steady current beneath the fear, binding them all together, grounding them in their shared strength. She moved among them, her presence a reminder of the resilience they carried within them, the unbreakable bond that held them together, even in the face of nature's fury. The night wore on, the storm raging around them with an intensity that seemed endless, each gust of wind more powerful than the last, each crash of thunder a reminder of the storm's wrath. Naima held her child close, her body shielding the small figure against the cold and damp, her own strength drawn from a place deep within her, a place that had been fortified by years of living close to the land, by the wisdom she had absorbed from Mzee Juma, by the love she felt for the village and its people. In the darkest hours, when the storm was at its peak, Naima felt a shift within herself, a quiet acceptance of the role she had taken on, the responsibility she now bore. She was no longer merely a guardian or a guide, she was a protector, a force of resilience, a symbol of the village's strength and endurance. She felt the weight of her role settle over her, grounding her even as the wind threatened to tear everything apart, and she knew, with a certainty as solid as the earth beneath her feet, that she would not waver, would not falter. As dawn approached, the storm began to relent, its fury dissipating, the wind easing, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle. The village emerged from its shelters, their faces weary but relieved, their eyes scanning the landscape for signs of damage. The ground was littered with fallen branches and debris, the once tidy paths transformed into rivers of mud, the roofs of several huts damaged or completely blown away. Yet there was no despair in their expressions, only a quiet determination, a shared understanding that they would rebuild, that they would heal. Naima moved among the villagers, helping them assess the damage, her hands steady as she lifted fallen branches, cleared pathways, offered comfort to those whose homes had suffered the worst. She could feel the weight of their trust, the quiet gratitude in their eyes as they looked to her for guidance, for the reassurance that they would recover, that their lives would return to normal. The elders gathered around her, their faces marked by both relief and respect, their expressions reflecting an unspoken acknowledgement of her role in holding the village together through the storm. They did not need to speak, their presence alone was enough, a silent testament to the strength they saw in her, the strength that had carried them all through the night. Naima met their gazes, feeling a deep, abiding connection to each one of them, a bond forged not through words but through the shared experience of survival, of resilience. Throughout the day, Naima worked alongside the villagers, helping to repair the damage, to rebuild what had been broken. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their hands working together as they restored the roofs, cleared the debris, patched the walls. Naima felt a deep pride as she watched them, their movements steady, their spirits unbroken, their faces filled with a determination that mirrored her own. They were a community bound by more than just proximity. They were a family, a collective force that could withstand even the fiercest storms. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the village, Naima took a moment to stand by the baobab tree, its branches swaying gently in the evening breeze, its roots holding firm in the earth. The tree had weathered the storm as it had countless others before, its ancient strength a reminder of the resilience that ran through the land, through the village, through her own heart. She placed her hand on its rough bark, feeling the pulse of life within it, the silent strength that had carried it through the ages. In that moment, Naima understood the true depth of her connection to the village, the unbreakable bond that held her to the land, to the people, to the rhythms of the earth and sky. She felt a quiet peace settle over her, a sense of fulfillment that ran deeper than words, a recognition that her life was woven into the village in ways that could never be undone. As she stood there watching the villagers as they gathered around small fires, their faces illuminated by the warm glow, their laughter mingling with the soft rustle of leaves, Naima felt a surge of gratitude, a love that encompassed not only the people but the land, the history, the future they all shared. The storm had tested them, had pushed them to their limits, but it had also revealed their strength, their resilience, their unbreakable spirit. When the first stars appeared in the sky, Naima looked up, her gaze tracing the familiar constellations, each one a reminder of the ancestors who had watched over the village, who had weathered their own storms, who had passed down the wisdom that now lived within her. She felt their presence around her, a quiet strength that filled her, grounding her, reminding her of her place in the unbroken cycle of life that bound them all. The storm had passed, but its memory remained, etched into the hearts of the villagers, a reminder of the power of nature, of the strength they carried within themselves, of the bond that held them together. And as Naima turned back toward the village, her heart filled with a quiet, steady resolve, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, a guardian, a protector, a part of the village's soul. In the quiet of the night, as the fires burned low and the village settled into sleep, Naima felt a deep, abiding peace, a certainty that her life was woven into the land, into the people, into the unyielding rhythm that would carry them all forward, through storms and calm alike. And as the stars watched over her, as steady and unchanging as the legacy she carried, Naima felt a love that reached beyond herself, a love that had taken root in the land, in the village, in the legacy of resilience that bound them all together. The passing seasons brought subtle changes to Naima's world, her child growing more curious, more attuned to the rhythms of the village, the land, and the people around them. As her child grew, Naima felt an awakening within herself, a quiet but insistent awareness that the time had come to pass on what she had learned, to sow the seeds of knowledge that would blossom in the next generation. This was a different kind of calling, a responsibility woven not from the immediate needs of the villagers, but from the timeless promise to continue the legacy of wisdom that bound them all. Each morning she would take her child to the edge of the village, where the first light of dawn painted the landscape in gentle hues of pink and gold. Here, beneath the open sky, she began her teachings, not in the way one instructs, but rather through the quiet immersion into the life around them. She would point to the sky, where birds flew in graceful patterns, their formations held by instincts as old as the earth itself. She would let her child feel the rough bark of the baobab tree, its texture like ancient stone beneath their small hands, a silent reminder of the resilience and endurance rooted deep within the land. Naima understood that true wisdom was not learned through mere words, it was absorbed through experience, through the senses, through the quiet moments spent observing the world. She guided her child's hands over the leaves and petals, letting them feel the softness, the fragility of life. Each touch, each moment was a lesson in connection, in respect for the living world, in the understanding that everything around them was woven into a single, unbreakable thread. During their walks she would pause by the stream, where Mzee Juma had once taught her to listen, to hear the murmurs of water over stone, the whispers of reeds bending in the breeze. She watched as her child's eyes brightened, following the darting fish that glinted just beneath the water's surface, their small bodies moving with a purpose that needed no explanation. She could see the beginnings of understanding in those young eyes, a quiet fascination with the life that thrived all around them, a spark of recognition that would, in time, grow into reverence. In the evenings, Naima would gather her child along with the other village children beneath the baobab's broad canopy. The tree's ancient branches stretched over them, sheltering them in a circle of shadows and soft, filtered light. Here she would tell them stories, the same tales that had once been told to her, passed down through generations. Her voice was low, steady, each word carrying the weight of history, the knowledge of the elders, the wisdom of those who had walked the land long before them. She spoke of the ancestors, of the spirits of the sea and sky, of the enduring strength of the land. Each story was a gift, a piece of the past offered freely to the future, an unspoken bond that held them all. The children listened, their faces illuminated by the fading light, their wide eyes filled with wonder as they took in the stories, the lessons hidden within the tales. Naima could see the way they absorbed her words, their young minds stretching to understand the world in a way that went beyond what was visible, what was immediate. They were learning not just from her stories but from the land itself, from the quiet patience of the tree, from the steady rhythms of life that pulsed around them. Naima's child would often look up at her with questions, their small hand reaching for hers, their gaze filled with the curiosity that came so naturally in youth. She would hold that small hand, a grounding connection, and guide them in silence, knowing that understanding would come in time, that the questions they held would find their answers within the village, the earth, and the sea. She felt Mzee Juma's spirit with her, a guiding presence that reminded her to teach with patience, to let the wisdom flow as naturally as the tides, as constant as the turning seasons. As the days stretched into weeks, Naima could see the growth in her child, in the other children who gathered around her. She saw the way they moved through the village, each step lighter, their gazes sharper, more aware. They had begun to carry themselves with a quiet reverence, a respect for the land and the people who had come before them, an awareness that they were part of something larger than themselves. She felt a surge of pride, of fulfillment, knowing that they were absorbing the knowledge, that they were becoming rooted in the traditions and stories that had sustained the village for generations. In the quiet moments, Naima would watch her child, sensing the legacy she was passing on, the wisdom that was settling within them, taking root, preparing to blossom. She knew that one day they would carry this knowledge forward, that they would become the keepers of the village's stories, the guardians of its spirit. It was a cycle as old as the land itself, an unbroken chain of love and learning, a legacy of resilience and respect that would continue long after she was gone. As the stars appeared overhead, Naima felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of completion, knowing that she was fulfilling her role, that the wisdom she had received was being passed forward, woven into the next generation. She held her child close, whispering a promise to the stars, to the spirits, to Mzee Juma, a promise that she would continue this path, that she would nurture and protect, that she would pass on the knowledge with the same care and reverence that had been given to her. And in the stillness of the night, beneath the ancient branches of the baobab, Naima felt the unbroken cycle that held them all, a legacy of love and wisdom that would carry them forward, guiding them, grounding them, connecting them to the land, the sea, and the people who had come before and who would one day follow. The day dawned quietly, the sun rising over the village with a soft, golden light that filled the air with a warm glow. Naima sensed something different in the atmosphere, a subtle shift, as though the land itself was holding its breath. She noticed the villagers moving with a slower, almost reverent pace, their faces touched by a quiet anticipation. The elders had summoned her to the baobab tree, a gathering that happened only for the most sacred of reasons. Naima's heart beat steady and calm, yet beneath that calm, she felt the hum of anticipation, a sense of the weight that awaited her. She knew the significance of the council's call. The elders did not often ask for her presence, they observed her from a distance, their gazes measuring, quietly assessing her growth, her choices, her place among them. She had felt this silent watchfulness over the years, and while their approval was rarely spoken, she sensed it in their subtle nods, their shared glances, and in the quiet trust they had placed in her through the small tasks and ceremonies they'd allowed her to lead. As she approached the baobab, Naima took a deep breath, grounding herself in the presence of the ancient tree, its branches reaching wide above her like protective arms. The elders were already gathered, forming a loose circle beneath its shadow. They stood in silence, their faces marked by the lines of age, each wrinkle a story, each crease a testament to a life deeply lived and connected to the land. She sensed that they were waiting for her, their presence an unspoken acknowledgement of the role she had grown into, a silent invitation for her to join their circle. Naima moved toward them, her steps measured, each one a small surrender to the path she had chosen, the responsibilities she had embraced. She could feel the weight of their gazes as she took her place within the circle, a steadying warmth that filled her with a sense of belonging. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but rather rich with meaning, as though each of them were sharing a moment of reflection, a silent recognition of the journey she had taken to reach this point. Anaya, the eldest among them, stepped forward, her expression calm but touched with a quiet pride. She held a kanga cloth, woven in deep, earthen colors, its patterns mirroring the land and sea that bound them. Naima recognized the kanga instantly. It was one that had once belonged to Mzee Juma, the same cloth he had worn in his own final years as a symbol of his role within the village. Anaya's hands moved slowly, her fingers tracing the fabric with a reverence that spoke of the trust they were placing in Naima, the legacy they were offering her. With a gentle, deliberate motion, Anaya placed the cloth over Naima's shoulders, her touch light but filled with the weight of tradition, of history, of a legacy that stretched far beyond any one life. Naima felt the fabric settle against her skin, its weight both comforting and humbling, a reminder of the responsibilities she now carried. She understood, in that silent moment, that she was being formally recognized as part of the council, that she was now one of them, a keeper of the village's wisdom, a protector of its stories and spirit. The other elders moved closer, each one placing a hand upon her shoulders, a gesture that felt as ancient as the village itself. Naima closed her eyes, letting the warmth of their hands ground her, their silent strength flowing into her, binding her to them in a way that words could never express. She felt the weight of their experiences, the collective knowledge of generations settling within her, a gift as sacred as the land they walked upon. As they stepped back, Naima opened her eyes, meeting each elder's gaze in turn. Their expressions held a mixture of pride, respect, and something deeper, an acknowledgement of the trust they had placed in her, the bond that now connected them. In their eyes she saw the stories they had carried, the lives they had touched, the silent endurance that had shaped them into the guardians of the village's soul. For a long moment they stood together in silence, the air thick with the presence of their ancestors, with the memories that were now hers to protect and pass on. Naima felt a deep peace settle within her, a grounding calm that came from knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be, that her life was now part of the village's heartbeat, an essential thread in the tapestry that bound them all together. As the first rays of full daylight broke over the trees, the council began to disperse, each elder moving back toward the village, their movements slow and measured, as though they were leaving behind a part of themselves in her care. Naima remained by the baobab, feeling the kanga draped over her shoulders, the soft weight of it like an embrace, a silent promise from those who had walked the path before her. She rested her hand against the tree's rough bark, grounding herself in the life of the land, in the history she was now a part of. In the quiet that followed, Naima understood the fullness of her role, the depth of the trust the council had placed in her. She was now not only a guardian of the village, but also a guide, a bridge between past and future, a keeper of wisdom and tradition. Her heart swelled with gratitude, with a love that reached beyond herself, encompassing the land, the people, and the spirits of those who had come before her. As the day began in earnest, Naima turned back toward the village, each step filled with purpose, her spirit fortified by the recognition she had received, the bond she now shared with the elders. She knew that her life would be forever entwined with theirs, that the legacy they had entrusted to her would continue through the generations, a testament to the strength and unity that bound them all. And as she walked, the kanga flowing around her like a second skin, Naima felt the spirit of Mzee Juma walking beside her, his presence a quiet strength that would guide her, comfort her, and remind her always of the role she had chosen, the path she would follow, and the legacy she would one day pass on. The decision to make the sacred journey to the distant cliffs came to Naima quietly, like a whisper carried on the wind, a feeling that had grown over time, a subtle pull that seemed to come from deep within her spirit. It was a journey Mzee Juma had once made himself, and though he had only spoken of it in fragments, Naima knew it was something she needed to undertake, not only to honor him, but to honor the bond they shared and the legacy he had entrusted to her. When she announced her intention to the village, the elders gave silent nods of approval, their eyes reflecting both pride and understanding. They knew the significance of the journey, the spiritual connection it held, the timeless tradition it represented. As word spread, a quiet reverence settled over the village, and a few villagers approached Naima, requesting to join her, to offer their presence as a gesture of solidarity and respect. They gathered at dawn on the day of departure, a small group of villagers, elders, children, and a handful of others who felt compelled to accompany her on this sacred journey. Each one carried a small token, a simple offering that symbolized their connection to Mzee Juma: a shell from the shore, a smooth stone, a woven bracelet, a sprig of herbs. Naima carried with her the kanga cloth that had belonged to him, its faded colors a reminder of his life, his spirit, and his enduring influence. The journey began in silence, their steps measured and slow as they followed the narrow path that wound through the forest, up toward the cliffs that rose in the distance. Naima led the way, her heart calm and steady, each step grounding her, connecting her to the land and to the memory of Mzee Juma. She could feel his presence with her, a quiet strength that filled her with a sense of peace, a reassurance that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As they walked, the sounds of the village faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor. The air grew cooler as they climbed, the scent of damp earth and moss surrounding them, mingling with the faint, salty breeze that drifted in from the sea. Each person carried their own thoughts, their own memories of Mzee Juma, the quiet respect they held for the man who had once been the village's guide, its silent protector. The path grew steeper as they neared the cliffs, and Naima felt the weight of the journey settle over her, not as a burden, but as a solemn reminder of the purpose that had brought them here. She knew that Mzee Juma had once stood on these very cliffs, had gazed out over the vast expanse of sea and sky, had felt the same pull, the same connection to the land, to the village, to the spirits that watched over them all. She felt herself drawn toward that same edge, her heart open, her spirit reaching out to the presence that seemed to linger in the air, a silent witness to the lives that had passed before. When they reached the cliffs, the group gathered in a loose circle, each person standing quietly, their gazes directed toward the horizon where the sea stretched out endlessly, its surface shimmering in the morning light. Naima moved to the center, holding the kanga cloth in her hands, her fingers tracing its worn edges, feeling the spirit of Mzee Juma woven into its threads. She closed her eyes, letting the wind carry her thoughts, her memories of him, her gratitude for the wisdom he had shared, the strength he had imparted to her. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, each placing their offering on the ground, a circle of shells, stones, herbs, and woven items that surrounded her like a protective ring. Each object carried a piece of their own memory of Mzee Juma, a reflection of the ways he had touched their lives, the quiet influence he had wielded, his presence a part of their history, their identity. In this simple act, they honored him, acknowledged the role he had played, the legacy he had left in their lives. Naima knelt, pressing her hand to the earth, feeling the solid ground beneath her, the strength of the cliffs that had stood through countless seasons, weathered by storms and sun alike. She placed the kanga at the center of the circle, letting it rest on the ground, a symbol of Mzee Juma's spirit, his unwavering connection to the village, to the land he had loved. The wind caught the edges of the cloth, lifting it gently as though it were alive, infused with the same breath of life that pulsed through the cliffs, the sea, the sky. In the silence that followed, Naima felt a deep calm settle over her, a sense of completion, of fulfillment. She knew that Mzee Juma's spirit was with them, that he was watching, his presence a quiet blessing that wrapped around her, holding her steady, grounding her in the purpose she carried. She felt the strength of the village within her, the unbroken chain of lives and stories that connected them all, a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. The villagers stood with her in quiet reflection, each one lost in their own thoughts, their own connection to the man they had come to honor. Naima looked out over the cliffs, her gaze drawn to the horizon, to the endless stretch of sea that lay before them. She knew that this journey, this act of remembrance, was more than a tribute to Mzee Juma. It was a reaffirmation of their own bond to the land, to the village, to the spirit that connected them all. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the cliffs, Naima felt a surge of gratitude, a love that encompassed not only Mzee Juma but the entire village, the land, the sea, the life that pulsed through every tree, every blade of grass, every person who had come before and who would come after. She knew that her journey was not yet over, that there would be other paths to walk, other lessons to learn, but in that moment she felt a profound peace, a quiet joy that filled her heart and wrapped around her like the gentle warmth of the sun. When the time came to return, Naima and the villagers gathered their offerings, each one taking a piece of the memory with them, a token of the journey, a reminder of the love and respect that bound them to the land, to each other, to the legacy they shared. They walked back in silence, their hearts light yet grounded, their spirits filled with the quiet assurance that they were part of something enduring, something sacred. As they descended from the cliffs, Naima felt a new strength within her, a quiet resolve that would guide her, support her, remind her always of the path she had chosen, the life she was leading. She knew that Mzee Juma's spirit would walk with her always, that his wisdom would continue to shape her, that his legacy would live on through her and through the village, as constant and unchanging as the cliffs, as boundless as the sea, as infinite as the sky. And as the village came into view, nestled beneath the wide, protective branches of the baobab tree, Naima felt a deep sense of belonging, a certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, that her life was woven into the heart of the village, into the unbroken cycle of love, remembrance, and connection that would carry them all forward, through the seasons, through the years, through the endless journey of life itself.